Hello YouTube. Today I'll tell you about two former Soviet scientists who are little known outside of the Soviet Union, but who had a very interesting knowledge about Mars, its secrets, and Soviet programs related to the planet Mars. One of them is Roald Savovich Kremnev, and his importance to me is primarily because of the Phobos 1989 Soviet space probe that was destroyed near Mars. And in my research years ago, I was able to find out that Roald Kremnev of the Babakin Space Testing Center, he was one of the top scientists who was involved with the failed or destroyed project, the Phobos 2. He mentioned a swarm of small bodies around the Soviet spacecraft Phobos 2 during the incident. And I will provide links to my other videos specifically about the Phobos 2 project. Very important one, because our governments in China, in the United States, in Russia, in the United Kingdom are very much interested in getting back to Phobos as soon as possible. And you should pay attention to what's going on with the space program developments around the world, especially when it relates to Mars. So when Kremnev mentioned this cause of the destruction of the Phobos 2 project, the question was, did this swarm of small bodies, did they cause the failure? Or, and he added this in the interview which was published in the Krasny Voin newspaper, Red Warrior, this was a military publication, in May of 1989. Or, and that's again, or was something else that's responsible for the destruction of the project. Kremnev again talked to Soviet journalist Leskov on April 14 of 1989 in the Izvestia newspaper, and stressed that the most discussed version of the failure among the top Soviet space scientists was the gigantic object that was registered 3 days before the accident. And still, there was no official conclusion. This is very interesting that the name of Kremnev even came up in the Soviet newspaper in 1989, because he was one of the most classified Soviet scientists. He was born in Siberia, in the small town of Toulon, in 1930. And he went to high school and then he left for Moscow. For many years, his relatives and anybody else did not really know about him, who he really was, what was going on, what he was doing. But after 2008, when he was declassified, so to say, they found out that Kremnev was an academician, designer. All his life was dedicated to the study of space exploration. He knew the top Soviet space scientist and father of the Russian space program, Sergei Korolev. And Kremnev had very good friendships with cosmonauts, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. All his life he wanted to build airplanes. That's how people who knew him discussed him. And in 1948 he became a student in the Aircraft Design Institute, but at that time they already talked about space exploration in the Soviet Union. It was the thing to be, the happening thing, so to say. So that's why he joined the program as a scientist. Again, many years his closest relatives did not know anything about him. His sister did not see him for 31 years. He couldn't talk about what he was doing because he signed special papers of non-disclosure, and he couldn't even have relationship with his close relatives. But like I said, in 2008 it was possible to talk about it, except in 1991, I and a former NASA scientist who had been studying Soviet ufology, well known, who is now retired from the field, we were able to get Soviet publications of the period, and we studied them for the explanation of the Phobos 2 destruction. And there's nothing secretive about it. All those publications at that time you could buy. It's just the time spent studying page after page of Soviet materials. Fascinating stuff. And I again urge you to keep your eyes on the Phobos program. Now, the Soviet scientist from Siberia, Kremnev, he underlined that he really did not work with Korolev. He wasn't his second in command, but he did get all the designs from Korolev. So he was a very highly placed scientist and kept a lot of secrets. He mentioned that Korolev, the last years of his life, was dreaming about going to the moon. He did quite a lot of it, but we know that the Soviets did not get there first. And he says, you can imagine how we felt when the Americans landed on the moon first. Well, Korolev was more or less a known person at the time in the Soviet Union, but other scientists were completely classified because they were engaged in military space exploration programs. Kremnev was also classified, like I said, and even today he doesn't like to talk too much about his activities when he was a classified Soviet scientist who helped develop new military aircraft and aerospace technology. He's quite old by now. He was born in 1930, but still he remembers and on occasion, not often, talks about it. He was quite involved in 1950s and 1960s in the Soviet space program, and he helped develop space stations Mir, Luna, Venera, Mars. He also was one of the people quite active in the joint Soviet-American project Soyuz Apollo. So Americans, of course, know about him. He often met with the cosmonauts and worked hand in hand with German Titov and Alexei Leonov, a very interesting Soviet cosmonaut, and his views on UFOs. Well, he was Kremnev's longtime friend. When asked about the death of Yuri Gagarin, Roald Kremnev did not want to talk too much. He says there are too many rumors now about his death. The official explanation, he believes it, but a lot of things are still unclear. But he is not allowed, or he cannot comment about this incident in the Soviet space program. It's interesting that in 1986, and this is a very important year for ufology, especially during the meetings between Gorbachev and Reagan, when aliens were mentioned, if you remember it. Well, in 1986, Kremnev was actually got to know the Pope John II in Vatican. It was under very unusual circumstances because in that time he was engaged in the research of the Vega space project, and actually he was considered to be the father of this project. It was called Project Vega, or for the Soviets it was Venus plus the Halley comet. And it had to do with the Halley comet coming to the vicinity of Venus, and the Soviets had a very interesting project in front of them. They had to get into the window, so to say, between the comet and Venus, take the picture of the comet, and then land their mission by finish their mission by actually landing on Venus. Well, for the Christians, this comet is of utmost importance. It was It was the Bethlehem Star, I believe this is what they call it. So this celestial body, which according to the Bible, Christian Bible, appeared during the birth of Jesus Christ, it was very important for the Pope, of course, and that's why the Soviet scientists from the Vega program were invited into Vatican. That's very interesting that such a classified scientist was actually allowed to travel there. But as I said before, the Soviets and the Americans worked hand in hand on many space exploration projects that we can't even imagine the scope of the closeness and the programs working together. I do reveal quite a lot about the American and the European involvement in the Soviet Phobos project, and that's just an example. Well, in the last years of his scientific activities, this designer was working on the lunar program for the Lavochkin Design Bureau and some other planets. We don't know all the details, of course. But in 2012, he stopped actually working actively in the Russian space program. And what he's doing now, of course, that's anybody's guess. There's another person that you need to know about, another Soviet scientist who is also retired. Well, he is a little bit more known in the United States because you see, in July of 1999, NASA published his monograph, translated into English, The Difficult Road to Mars, A Brief History of Mars Exploration in the Soviet Union, by V.G. Perminov. It was a joint publication of the NASA History Division Office of Policy and Plans and Office of Space Science. Monographs in Aerospace History. And what's interesting that Perminov was the leading designer for Mars and Venus spacecraft at the Lavochkin Design Bureau in the Soviet Union during the early days of Mars exploration. So in his book, he recounts the hectic days and urgent atmosphere in the communist bureaucracy to design and successfully launch a Mars orbiter, a Mars lander, and a Mars rover. The goal was to beat the United States to Mars. The author's account gives to the Western people, for the first time, the personal feelings of those managing the program. What's important to us is that Perminov talked about ancient civilizations of Mars in this monograph, in this book that was published by NASA in 1999. And he mentioned that one cannot rule out that the cities covered by sand may exist in the Martian deserts. That would be the evidence of an ancient Martian civilization that disappeared or moved to other planets. Perhaps Martians once arrived on Earth and left some evidence of their visit. Perhaps they built huge runways in South America, maybe constructed a chemically pure iron column in India. Now chemically pure iron can be produced only in the laboratory. And he continued, build the mysterious Egyptian pyramids. It is also possible that the English fiction writer Swift managed to find and decipher records that Martians left on Earth. Based on these records, long before the Martian moons were discovered, Swift predicted that Mars had two satellites. One of them he named Phobos, fear, and the other one he named Deimos, horror, and rather precisely predicted the parameters of their orbits. I will have a link to my video about the ancient map of Mars that is located, as far as we know, in Armenia, in one of the museums. And this is the map that was originally from the Alexandria Library. I wish I could ask Perminov about this map. I'm sure he knows quite more than he revealed in his monograph. He also continued in the same book published by NASA that the first stage of Mars exploration is finished. Surprisingly, vegetation, canals, and traces of intelligent lives have not been found. However, dried up courses of waterways have been observed. What happened? Why did water disappear? Did primitive or intelligent life exist in the past, or does it exist now on Mars? Today we cannot answer these questions. It now seems like Mars is a lifeless desert. On the other hand, we know that in Earth's deserts, archaeologists dig up cities that flourished in the past but were neglected by ancient people, and they are now covered with sand. Of course, in 1999, nobody knew about the presence of water on Mars, or I'm sure they knew, just we did not know that our governments have such knowledge. Today, the Russian scientist is retired. Obviously, he has more information, but most likely cannot share it. There are secrets that outlive nations that generated such secrets. For example, there is no more Soviet Union, but the secrets of the Soviet space exploration remain. It's very interesting. One of the few people that I know got to see him were journalists from the Russian newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda. And when they asked him questions 11 years ago, 2007, they mentioned that Western researchers were trying to get a hold of him but could not find him. But Russian journalists, they know where he is. And he's retired, but he was healthy at the time, and they were able to ask him about Mars. And he mentioned that he didn't know anything about the cities at that time, when the book was written. But he did see deltas of the gigantic rivers. And he was sure that Mars contained water. And he is sure even more now that there was life. He doesn't want to say at which level, but he says life existed there. And he didn't go too much into his ideas about ancient cities on Mars, but obviously he and Kremlov, they knew quite a lot. And someday maybe we'll find out more about the Russian or Soviet Martian secrets. Thank you.